With our activity layout done and our bottom navigation having its menu now that we can see there with running and cycling, we are getting tantalizingly close to moving on to fragments, to learning about this new way of displaying our user interface, having portions of the screen not in an activity but in a fragment. However, before we do that, we do need to get reference to this bottom navigation view, so we do need to go to our main activity code and find this view on the screen. And there is something new that we now need to do. So let's move over to main activity. I'm going to press Shift and main activity. And now in this file, we need to find the view. So if you remember from the Kotlin section, I said one of the goodies of Kotlin was this Kotlin X synthetic thing, this Kotlin extensions plugin in our build.gradle file. In that Gradle file with that plugin, which we're going to have a look at in a moment, rather than doing find view by ID for every single view and having a class property, we could just type the ID directly. And that saved us a lot of time. However, in Android Studio, things change rather quickly, and this is now no longer the recommended way of doing things. Let me show you what I mean. If we can head over to our build.gradle file, it's inside our app folder, and it's underneath the source folder. So if you're kind of at main activity, well, you just need to close the app folder, open it again, and find this build.gradle file. Remember, it is the app build.gradle file, not the project one, not this one. So go ahead and launch this build.gradle file inside our app folder. Okay, and if, like me, you have any pop-ups at the top of the file, just go ahead and hide them. So I'm going to hide both of those. So in our build.gradle file, which at the bottom has our dependencies, our shopping list, okay, some app configuration stuff that we haven't looked at yet that we don't really need to worry about, and these plugins at the top, these things to make the Gradle system work. The thing that builds our app relies on these plugins. Now, in the Kotlin section where I showed you those shortcuts to find view by ID, where we can just type the ID directly, well, that was dependent on a plugin that was Kotlin-Android-extensions. And at the time, when I recorded that video, when you made a new project, you got that by default. Well, now, in a new project, Android Studio no longer gives us that plugin by default. And in fact, if you were following along with the course and you did it more recently, you may have got to that tutorial and had to have typed it in manually. I did mention if it wasn't there, you'd have to go ahead and type ID and then Kotlin-Android-extensions. Okay? So I'm just going to delete this now for 1 second. So without that plugin, if I go back to main activity, and I try to look at one of the views in activity_main, like our bottom nav, well, if I just start typing bottom nav now, lowercase b, bottom_nav, you can see we don't get any suggestions, any ability to import. This thing is not recognized. And it's not recognized because we don't have the extensions by default. So let's just for the moment go ahead and put this plugin back in. So let's do ID and then Kotlin-Android-extensions, just like in the tutorial where I introduced this. And once you've changed this Gradle file, you can click sync now, or you can click the elephant with an arrow. I'll click sync now. And now when I go back to main activity, I have the ability to import this, or indeed if I start typing, I'll be suggested it as an autocomplete. And the second I do that, if I expand the imports, you can see we have this Kotlin X thing, this synthetic, basically our activity_main .star, meaning all of the available things inside this we can now use. So if I go to the layout file, I could also refer to the frame_content. So I could type frame content, okay? But this leads us to a very important question. Why is Android Studio no longer providing us this by default in new projects? And there's a very simple answer to that. Android no longer recommends us to use this for a couple of reasons. It's what's called deprecated. They're saying, we're not going to support this anymore. We don't want you to use this anymore, really. We still can, it's not a problem, but there's a couple of reasons why. And the number one reason, and the reason which I'm going to cover in this tutorial, is the fact that it's not very safe, okay? We can actually type an ID from any layout file, not activity_main. It would import fine, we would have access to that variable fine. When we click run, the app would build, it would launch, but then the app would crash at what's called runtime. It would crash when the app is running, and that's a big problem. So to prove this, I'm going to go ahead and make another layout file. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, although you can if you want to copy along. So I'm going to go to activity_main, and I'm going to click the target button to jump to the layout folder. Okay, there we go. I'm going to right click on the layout folder and do new layout resource file. And I'm going to call this something like different screen, so different layout. I'll leave a constraint layout and I'll just stick one view, a text view. I'll do match parent, really lazy to do that in our constraint layout. I should use 0dp, but it's fine to do that. So with match parent, no need to constrain it or anything. And I'll do some text that just says my dummy text view, and I'll give it an ID. So ID, text, view, different, layout. Okay? If I now go back to main activity, yes, I have a bottom nav, yes, I have a frame content that's an activity_main, but look what happens when I type text, view, different layout. I'm able to import it, so I'll go ahead and import this. And I can even do things with this. I can do .text to change the text, and I'll just say, I'm trying to update the text on a view that isn't in main activities layout, exclamation mark. Okay, so with these Kotlin X things, these synthetic access all of our views that save us loads of time, it saves us the ability to find view by ID all the time. Well, I've been allowed to access and indeed play with, use a view from a completely different layout. So let's see what happens when I try to run this app now. I'm going to go ahead and click run on the emulator. And you see that? The app crashes. We get an alert saying that it keeps stopping. So if I now go to logcat, where we can see the errors, so logcat at the bottom, and make sure it's filtered by our app, so record keeper. If I change this to error, so error, if I just expand this a little bit, we have a null pointer exception. Text view, different layout, must not be null. And it's line 16. So this is the problem line 16. So we made an attempt to access this text view, different layout, so this on its own didn't fail. But when we tried to call .text on it, well, this actually returns null. Android tried to look for this view ID on the screen and couldn't find it, it returned null. But then we're doing .text on something that is null. So this is what I mean, and this is what Android means by it not being very safe. So for this reason, they don't recommend we use Kotlin extensions anymore for finding our views. What I would do to prove this is show you how this is now deprecated. If I now head over to my browser, and I'll just do a very specific search for Android Kotlin synthetic. And straight away you can see it's actually suggesting us this deprecated thing. So people are discovering that this thing is suddenly no longer recommended. So we'll search for Android Kotlin synthetic being deprecated. And the top result I get is this thing saying developer.android.com/libraries/migration. Migration meaning they're telling us to move away from Kotlin synthetics. So if I go ahead and click this, Kotlin Android extension is deprecated, which means that using Kotlin synthetics for view binding is no longer supported. Okay? This doesn't mean we can't use it, but it does mean that if we want to be best practice, we should probably move away from it. Okay? I'm going to come back to this article in a moment to see what this new view binding thing is, this thing you can see here. Okay? But first I want to show you the evolution of how we find views on Android. It's gone through various stages. So back to main activity, I'm going to remove all of these Kotlin synthetic views here. Okay? So the first way would have been to make a property for each view. So private val bottom nav of type bottom navigation view. Okay? We're supposed to initialize it in Kotlin, so I'll make it a late init that we've seen before. So late init, we'll initialize this later, and then we can do bottom nav equals find view by ID, and then we do r.id, the name of the view. This is the very first way we did it back in the earlier sections. We did it in Java, that we had a class property at the top, and then we did find view by ID. And I can do the same for the frame layout. So frame content, that's a frame layout, and I'll do the same thing. So frame content equals find view by ID. Okay, so this is the first and original way to find the views in our layout files and start doing things with them. And it's still fine to do this. You can go ahead and make a property for each view, and then find it somewhere in onCreate. Okay. The problem with this is it's not very pretty. You end up with lots and lots of class properties, more and more for every view you have on your screen, and it doesn't make for clean and tidy code. Then, somewhere between find view by ID and the Kotlin synthetic thing that we've seen before, was a library called Butterknife. You don't need to worry about this, you don't need to look at this, but there was some popular developer who knows a lot about Android and now works for Google called Jake Wharton, and he made a library. And what you do is, rather than doing find view by ID, you would just do some sort of annotation like override. So you'd put something like bind view, you'd give it the ID here, okay? And there would be one line that you'd write somewhere in onCreate, something like this. And then that would take care of binding the views for you. So you would have solo class properties, but you wouldn't have to do find view by ID for every single view. You would just do one butterknife.bind this. That would save us a few lines, okay? And this became quite popular at the time. I'm showing this for you just as a brief history of the evolution of Android and evolution of best practice, okay? This library is also marked as deprecated, so Jake Wharton is no longer supporting this because there are better ways. I just thought I'd show you that in case in your Android developer career you ever hear the term butterknife, or you ever work on any old project which has butterknife in it, this was incredibly popular. So we'll remove this, and I'll remove the properties for now. So the next major way to use it was to use Kotlin extensions where you would just type the name of the view, so bottom nav, and away you go, okay? That's now been deprecated, so what's the recommended practice now is this thing called view binding. So having shown you the history of how we find views on our screen, from find view by ID to butterknife to Kotlin X to this new view binding practice, we'll move on to the next tutorial now to how this view binding works. We'll confirm again why we should be using this, why it's safer, and then once we've learned that in the next tutorial, from this point in the course onwards, we will use the view binding approach, at least until something better or more recommended comes along, okay? So having just covered the history of how we find views in our code, all the way from the default find view by ID through to Kotlin synthetics, and then now to this view binding, it's time to learn how this view binding actually works. I'm back on the Android documentation that talks about migrating from Kotlin synthetics, which is deprecated, over to this view binding. So now I can see there's a link to the view binding here, so I'm going to click this and have a look at the documentation for the new view binding approach. So if we read this first paragraph, it gives us a pretty good overview of what view binding is. View binding is a feature that allows you to more easily write code that interacts with views. Once view binding is enabled, it generates a binding class. Okay, so it generates a bit of code for us, and this is for each XML layout file present in the project or module. Okay, so for every layout file we have, there will be a bit of Java or Kotlin code. An instance of the binding class contains direct references to all views that have an ID in the corresponding layout. And the last line there, in most cases, view binding replaces find view by ID. So we can go ahead and get this set up. We're going to follow some of the instructions below. And once we're done with this, there'll be one file, one bit of code, one class, and that class will contain all of the views that have an ID in that layout file. Okay. So if I scroll down to the set of instructions, I can see view binding is enabled on a module by module basis. Well, right now we only have one module. We just have our app module. Okay. We don't need to worry at all about multi-module projects. So we have our app module. So we enable this in the build.gradle file for the module. This is the app build.gradle file, the one we've just seen in the previous tutorial, not the project one. Okay. So all we need to do inside the Android tag, which we can see in a moment. Okay. So you see the Android and the curly brackets. We need to add another little block in this strange groovy structure. This isn't Java or Kotlin. It's groovy. We need to add build features and then view binding true. So go ahead and copy this. Build features view binding true. Don't copy the dots before it. And I'm going to switch back to Android Studio. I'm currently in main activity, so I'm going to move over to build.gradle. You can see the app build.gradle. Okay. And inside this Android block here, I'm going to add a new block. It's a block called build features. I can see I've got build types, default config, but no build features block. So outside all of these little blocks, I'll put it between default config and build types. I'm going to make a few line breaks, and I'm just going to paste in that build features block. So Control V, Command V. Okay, and you can see I've got build features, a curly braces block, and then this simple view binding true property. Okay. So with that pasted, I'm going to click sync now, or the elephant with the arrow. Sync that with Gradle. That will take a moment or two. Okay, so that is done. And with this property in our Gradle file, all of our layout files you see on the left there will be a corresponding view binding class. So let's go back over to the guide to see what we need to do next to start using this. It tells us if we have any particular layout file, if we want to not create a class, we can do tools, view binding ignore, but that's not important right now, so we can skip past that. In the usage, it talks about if it's enabled, then for every layout file, anything with an ID will be available to us. So here's an example of a layout file called result profile with a text view, image view, and a button, and the text view and the button has an ID. So the layout file is called result underscore profile, and the generated binding class is called, with a capital R, result profile binding. So it converts the snake case into uppercase words, okay, and adds the word binding. So result underscore profile becomes result profile binding. Activity underscore main becomes activity main binding. That's the pattern, okay? And inside this class, inside this generated bit of code, thanks to that thing we put in our build.gradle file, inside this binding class, there'll be a field, a property for every view that has an ID. So in the example above, the text view and the button has an ID, so there'll be two fields, a text view called name and a button called button. But because the image view has no ID, then there's no reference to that in the binding class. So that's the key thing to remember, that everything that has an ID, it will create a corresponding binding class with those fields, with those properties available to us, which is fantastic. So if I scroll down now to using this view binding activities, I can see we need to make a property called binding, and they're using the late init variable, which is fine, we'll do the same. So a late init variable called binding, or called whatever you want, and it's of type, your layout file plus the word binding. So for us, activity main binding. You'll see this in a moment. We then assign this in onCreate, and all we do is we take the name of the class, so result profile binding, activity main binding, dot inflate, and we pass in an argument called layout inflator that's available to us in all activities. So this is the key line, okay? And then once we've created that binding class, that binding variable, we've set content view on binding.root. The root of this class will be the view. So this set content view, that variable, is binding.root. Now some of this might seem a bit confusing, so rather than looking at the documentation trying to picture it in our heads, let's go ahead now in main activity and switch over to using view binding. So back to Android Studio, and back to main activity. So I'm going to remove the bottom nav Kotlin synthetic thing, I'm going to remove all of those unused imports, okay? And the first thing I'm going to do is create a single class property called binding. So private later init var, I'll call it binding, nice and simple. And if we look on the left in the project pane in our layout folder, the layout file is called activity_main. So can you have a think about what the name of the class would be? Activity main binding. So capital A, activity main binding. And you can see that's available to us, so we're going to autocomplete. So this is a generated bit of code that comes from that view binding thing. From this here, it's generated for us. If I jump over to activity_main, I can see I've got two things with IDs, the frame layout called frame content, and the bottom navigation view called bottom nav. Comes from that view binding thing. From this here, it's generated for us. If I jump over to activity_main, I can see I've got two things with IDs, the frame layout called frame content, and the bottom navigation view called bottom nav. I can see that both of my IDs are in snake case with underscores, but just like our binding class name, just like this activity main binding, all of those views will be created to uppercase or camel case for our properties. So going back to our guide, I can see the next thing I need to do is assign the binding variable. So binding equals the name of the binding class dot inflate, and then we pass in a layout inflator that's available to us in activities. So I'll do the same thing. So I'm going to delete set content view. We're not going to do it this way with a layout file directly. So delete that, leave super.onCreate, and we'll do binding equals activity main binding. And you can actually autocomplete one of the two inflate methods. So I'll go for the first one, the one that says layout inflator. So activity main binding dot inflate, and then all we pass in here is a layout inflator. And if you start typing with a lowercase l, layout, and capital I inflator, this is available to us in app compat activities, part of inheritance. We have access to this. So autocomplete that, and that is done. In this onCreate method, we will take that layout file and we will inflate it. We will read the XML and create that binding class. But this won't put it on the screen. It will only put it on the screen when we do set content view. So underneath this binding assignment, type set content view again, autocomplete. Now if I look there at the hint, I can either pass in at the very top a layout resource, layout res ID. That's what we have been doing, remember, r.layout.activity_main. So that's the old way of doing it. But we can also pass in a view, an inflated view. This is what happens to our layout files once they're inflated. They become a view. So we've inflated this activity main binding thing. We've inflated that layout file. All those views are ready to use. And if we go back one final time to our documentation, we can see there is a property on these binding files called binding.root. And you can see here, we can get a reference to the root view. That's the whole layout file, the top element. We can do this by calling getRoot or just doing .root, okay? So that's what we need to do. So we can create a view variable by doing val view, and that's equal to binding.root. And then you can pass in that view variable, okay? And actually, the local variable is not even needed. We can delete this and just type into here binding.root directly, okay? So the final thing I should do to prove that we have access to all these views is show you. So binding dot, you can see the first two suggestions are the two views we have available, our bottom nav and our frame content. And you can see it's done that as camel case, or lowercase b and uppercase n, frame content with a lowercase f. If I go to my activity_main, we can see the IDs were in snake case, as this is the recommended way of doing it in layout files. So just like activity_main gets converted to activity main binding with capital letters, well, our properties get converted to camel case. So frame content bottom nav becomes frame content and binding dot bottom nav. So just for a moment, let's talk about why this is so good. Why is this such a useful and safe and important way of doing things? Well, first of all, we don't need to have class properties for all of our views. We don't need a private bottom nav and a frame layout. We don't have a variable for all of our views, like with the find view by ID method, okay? All we need is one variable, the binding, okay? And inside that binding will be every single view that has an ID. So this gathers up all of our views into one variable. So that's the first useful time-saving feature. The second thing, which is to do with safety and not causing crashes, unlike with Kotlin X synthetic, where you could type a ID from any layout, even one you're not using, and then if that layout happens to not be the one that's inflated, that happens to not be the one on the screen, then it crashes. Well, because we're setting the content view to be the binding.root, this activity main layout file, we can be absolutely 100% confident that all of the views are inside this layout file. It is not possible to have reference to a view that is not in this layout file. If I try and do binding.text view different layout, remember that ID from the different screen, it's just not in there, okay? You will only have access to the fields and views that are in the file. And the final thing which makes this really safe and really secure is the typing. Okay, so remember with find view by ID, we would have to specify the type. So we have to do something like find view by ID and say it was a text view, okay? But it would be actually possible to say the bottom nav was a text view, even though it's not, and that would cause a crash. So it's what's called not being type safe, okay? We have no way of knowing if this bottom nav ID is a text view or not. I assign these to local variables. I'll just call this bottom nav, and I'll call this my frame, okay? And if I do a nice little Android Studio shortcut where I'll Alt, Enter, or Option, Enter on frame, and I can say specify type explicitly, okay? You see how it autocompletes frame layout, and how this autocompletes bottom navigation view? These properties, binding.frame content, binding.bottom nav, Android knows it's a frame layout, it knows it's a bottom navigation view. So it's what's called type safe. We are guaranteed to have all of the views and only the views inside activity main, inside this binding variable, and we're also guaranteed to have the correct types, frame layout, bottom navigation view. And it's for this reason that Android Studio now recommends that this is the best way to handle setting your content view and handling the finding the views, the find view by ID thing, okay? And just to prove this works, let's go ahead now to activity main and just put a text view on the screen and change the text in code. So I'm going to delete these local variables here. I'm going to go to activity underscore main. I'm going to comment out the frame content for now and get rid of that for a moment. And just add a text view. Match parent, we'll do gravity, we'll center it so it's in the middle of the page. I'll do some preview text using tools. So I'll say example text, so we can see on the right where it will show. And of course, I'll give it an ID. So with giving it an ID, text view example, we will have access to it in our binding variable. So if I go back to main activity, I can do binding.text view example. We have access to it, and it knows it's a text view, so I can do .text, and it equals to we can now use view binding. Hooray. And if I go ahead now and run this app, we can see we can now use view binding. Hooray. And the binding and the set content view, it all works as expected. So, as mentioned in the last tutorial, from this point forwards in the course, I will be using view binding wherever relevant, both in activities and shortly also in fragments, okay? However, you are free in your own personal project to choose whichever method of finding the views works for you. If I just go back to Android Studio, you might want to just do a variable for every view, okay? You might do something like later init var, and then just assign them later one by one. Find view by ID, add id.bottomNav. That would be fine to do. You might decide you don't want a class property, a field for every single view, and you like the Kotlin X thing. So that would be fine. You'd go to build.gradle, you would put in plugin ID Kotlin Android extensions, and then you can just type the variable directly from the file like this, exactly as it is. And as long as you're sure you've got the right layout file and you've tested running the app and there's no crashes, that would be fine to do. So feel free to carry on using Kotlin X synthetic. Just because it's deprecated, just because it's not recommended by Android Studio, that doesn't mean you're not allowed to use it. That is your choice, okay? But if you want to be completely up to date, latest best practice, then the best way is to use this view binding. So I'm going to remove the Android extensions for now. Sync with Gradle. So when I go back to main activity, this will cause some errors. You can see that's no longer available, so I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove all of the unused imports and this bottom nav thing. So if in your build.gradle you have build features view binding true, then you will automatically have this binding class for every one of your layout files. This is how we inflate it, and you'll see this over and over again from this point forward, so you'll soon get used to this. And it's just 2 lines. Assign the binding variable with .inflate, and then set content view with the binding.root, rather than the layout file directly. That's all we need to do. Once you've done that, you have all of your views available in the binding variable. Super safe, super up to date, and in my opinion, the best way of doing things. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the text view example. I'm going to go back to activity main. I'm going to undo creating the text view, undo, and undo commenting out the frame layout. Okay. So we now have our bottom navigation view using view binding ready to start playing with and getting it working with fragments. So in the next tutorial, let's finally look at what fragments are in Android Studio and how they work.